Hello. So in today's unit, we're going to be talking about the role of hydration during exercise and the importance of hydration as it relates to just general physiological function, as well as exercise capacity and performance. So when we think about water, water is super important because it constitutes such a major portion of our bodies. So between 50 to 70% of our body is actually made up of fluids. And this is dependent on body composition. So lean muscle mass contains significantly more water in comparison to fat mass or adipose tissue. So again, the more fit someone is, or the more highly trained an individual is, the higher their or the lower their body fat percentage is, the more water composition they have. Okay, so again, our fit individuals are going to be closer to that 70% mark. Our average or untrained individuals are going to be closer to that 50% mark. Okay, so again, knowing that fluids are such an important contributor to our general, our body in general, that gives us really a good idea that, consuming appropriate amounts of water will also be important because our fluid state is extremely dynamic. And what we mean by that is it's easy for those fluids to move from compartment to compartment within the body. We'll kind of talk about those different compartments here coming up in the next couple slides. So what are the functions of water? What do I need water for within the body? Okay. Number one is going to serve as a solvent. And I believe I have a slide for each of these to kind of explain some of these in a little bit more detail. But a solvent basically serves as like a substance that can serve as kind of the background for different chemical reactions and things like that to happen within. So solvent is number one. Number two is temperature regulation. So again, we can use fluids in a variety of ways. We can use fluids to retain heat. So again, I can keep my blood like at my core and constrict blood flow from like my fingers and my skin surface. And that's going to allow me to maintain heat within my core and maintain the heat within my like visceral organs, or I can use water as a way to dissipate heat or get rid of heat. Okay, we can do that through sweating. We can also shuttle our blood to the skin surface so that the heat is close to the skin surface so that we can dissipate heat that way as well. So water can serve as a way for us to hold on to heat, but also as a way for us to get rid of heat as well. So temperature regulation is number two. Maintenance of acid-base balance is number three. So acid-base balance has to do with the level of acidity or basicness that we find within the body, in particular within the bloodstream. So again, we can manipulate how much fluids we have in various locations, and that can certainly affect our pH balance or the acid-base balance that we have. Let's see, the next one is provide a medium for transportation. So again, we've got all these different systems within the body. For example, the cardiovascular system is going to use the blood as a way to transport oxygen and nutrients and waste products and those types of components. And so, the amount of fluid that we have within the cardiovascular system will play a role in the efficiency of movement or transportation of those molecules. Okay. Let's see, also the lymphatic system is another example of a system that's going to have movement occurring or serve as a way for us to transport different molecules. So again, we have to have some fluid within that system in order for the transportation pathways to be effective. Next we have helps remove waste products. So again, water will serve as kind of the major component of two of our major wastes. Number one being sweat. So again, when we sweat, we're losing fluids, and those fluids are going to help us to carry some of those waste products out of the body. And number two would be urine. So again, many of those same components that we find in sweat are also found in urine, and we have to have fluid within the system that we can excrete in order to carry away some of those waste products out of the body. Number six, we have lubrication for our joints. So again, we've got synovial fluid that's found in any of our synovial joint, and a synovial joint is just really any joint that has movement at all. And so we've got some fluid in there that's going to allow us to lubricate both ends of the bone so we don't have any kind of bone-on-bone action. That'd be bad and cause a lot of pain. So again, fluids serve as an important component of that synovial fluid that will allow us to lubricate the joints. And then lastly, bile, saliva, and amniotic fluid. So again, three really different things here, but when we think about bile, again, bile is going to be important for the breakdown and metabolism of fat molecules. So that's going to be important within the digestive and absorptive processes. Saliva will also be an important component when we think about digestion. So again, saliva is going to help us to lubricate the food so that it can slide down the esophagus without causing abrasion in the throat. And it also starts the breakdown of carbohydrate metabolism. So again, saliva is an important component of those digestive processes. And then amniotic fluid is going to serve as a shock absorber for pregnant women. So again, we've got a lot of fluid that surrounds the fetus, and that's going to help the fetus to stay suspended and not, again, have any abrasion or any issues that way. It keeps that fetus safe and absorbs the shock as that fetus continues to grow. Okay, so when we look at the locations of fluid within the body, so you can see that there are really three different components. When we look at our total body water, I'm going to turn my little pointer on here. When we look at the total body water volume, again, about 60%, we said 50 to 70% of the total body weight. But here you can see intracellular fluid, then we have extracellular fluid. So again, intracellular means inside of the cells. So the fluid within inside of the cells is accounting for the greatest proportion of fluids within the body, and that'll account for about 40% of our total body weight. Okay, and then you can see, about 20% of our body weight is made up of this extracellular fluid. And the extracellular fluid is fluid that lies outside of those individual cells. And really two different components we can think about when we look at this extracellular fluid. Number one is interstitial fluid. And this interstitial fluid is just kind of like the fluid that is suspending those cells. So again, it can be in many different compartments within the body. So again, it might be surrounding the muscles, for example. It might be surrounding, some of those visceral organs, for example. Okay, and then the plasma volume is significantly more specific. And the plasma volume is simply going to be the fluid that makes up the blood. Okay, so the plasma volume is the fluid component of our bloodstream, and the plasma volume is around 50% of our blood volume will be found in the plasma. Okay. So again, what factors make up, or what factors are important in determining how much fluid we have in each of these various locations. So number one is body composition. Okay. So if we increase the amount of body fat that we have, we're going to decrease the amount of body water. Okay, so again, when we think about the difference between fat and muscle, fat, again, as we mentioned in our last unit, is hydrophobic in nature. So fat does not like to be suspended in water, and so as a result, the more fat mass you have, the less water you have within those particular types of cells. Okay, the more muscle mass I have, the more water I'm going to have, because that muscle likes to be suspended in a fluid kind of base, or in that extracellular fluid being made up of water, right? Number two is carbohydrate content. And so carbohydrates are very hydrophilic. So carbohydrates love to be stored with water. So for every carbohydrate molecule that you have stored in the body, you have at least 2.4 grams of water per carb gram. Okay, I have it written down. So one carb molecule is stored with approximately 2 water molecules. Okay, so for every carb you have, double that as it relates to water content, and that's what we store. So, you think about like these low carb diets and how people are like losing like a ton of weight really fast. Well, the major reason for that has to do with this component, that carbohydrate component. So again, if I go on a low fat or on a low carb diet and I'm not consuming carbs, I'm going to deplete the carb stores that I have. And as I deplete those carb stores, I'm also releasing that water that's stored with the carb. Okay, so again, let's say I burn, 100 calories of carbs out of my storage. well, 200 grams of water will also be released and like removed from the body basically when you do that. So again, we think about the amount of water weight that an individual is losing. Again, that's at least half of the weight that somebody is losing if they're on a low carb diet because of the relationship between carbohydrate storage and fluid storage. Okay. And then number 3 is electrolyte concentration inside and outside the cells. So some of those electrolytes, in particular sodium and potassium, are going to pull water with them. So if I have a lot of those electrolytes, that's going to allow me to sustain my fluid concentration within the body. So again, you think about somebody who is hypertensive, for example. Hypertension is when you have high blood pressure. So one of the things we want to do for people that are hypertensive is to reduce or eliminate salt from their diet. And the reason that that's effective is if I have less salt, then that's going to allow me to retain less fluid. Okay. The same kind of concept when we think about like eating something salty. Like I love, and my 3-year-old son loves the salt and vinegar chips. But when you do that, man, you want to drink like a gallon of pop, or you want to drink like, a bunch of water or something with it, because those salt molecules pull water with them, right? So it makes you feel thirsty because those salty molecules want fluid to go with it. Okay, so they're very attracted to each other. And again, that will allow us to increase the amount of fluids that we have within the body, for better or for worse, depending on the situation. So as we kind of mentioned, we think about water movement. Water movement is generally based on ion movement, okay? And so when we think about ions are any molecules that provide us with charge, okay? So again, we think about what this means from a chemical standpoint. Here you can see these various chemical components that all have a plus or a minus beside them, okay? In this particular scenario, we also consider these electrolytes. And these electrolytes, again, give us some sort of charge. Okay, so if these molecules are charged, they tend to also pull water with them. Okay, so by controlling the movement of ions in and out of the cell, we can also control the appropriate amount of water within each compartment. Okay, again, I mentioned a few of these being pretty strong as it relates to pulling water, having that affinity for water. So sodium and potassium. So Na is sodium, K is potassium, chloride, phosphate, magnesium, calcium. So again, those are all examples of chemicals or electrolytes that are going to have a strong influence on where water is going to move. Okay, so again, if I can cause sodium to move into a certain compartment, water will also tend to follow that sodium because it wants to, pull that water with it. It has a high affinity for water. We mentioned that one of the major functions of fluids within the body is to help us with temperature regulation. And again, as we mentioned, this can be important when we think about heat conservation, which is keeping that heat in, and heat dissipation, which is going to allow us to get rid of heat from the body. Okay, so water temperature changes slowly because it is a great way for us to hold heat. Okay, so the blood, for example, serves as an excellent medium for us to carry heat. And so for those reasons, we can manipulate where we send the blood, and that will in part make a huge difference as it relates to heat movement. Okay, so again, if I keep if I want to keep the heat at my core, like if I'm in a cold environment, again, what's the first thing to get cold if I'm in a cold environment? My fingers, my nose, my ears, those are going to get cold pretty quickly, right? And the reason for that is I'm going to constrict blood flow to those particular locations. And that's my body's way of saying like, hey, we don't really need fingers. We need to maintain, those visceral organs that you have at your core. And that's more important than, saving your fingers, for example. And so we're going to constrict blood flow to those kind of visceral areas, and that's going to allow us to maintain heat. Okay, as we mentioned, heat dissipation, we can open up those vessels or vasodilate those vessels that lead to the skin surface. If any of you kind of get flushed cheeks when you exercise, or if you're in a hot environment, the reason for that is you're sending blood to the skin surface. Again, it's probably more common with fair-skinned people because it's easier to kind of see that difference. So again, if your face becomes flushed, the reason for that is we have an increase in blood flow to the skin surface, and if I bring that heat closer to the skin surface, that increases the likelihood that that heat will be accepted into the ambient environment around me. Okay, so again, we think about the movement of blood. This is super important as it relates to both conservation and dissipation. Okay, the other factor when we think about dissipation is evaporation of sweat. So again, I can carry fluid to my skin surface. I can create sweat from the sweat glands, and that will allow me to put water on my surface of my skin and allow me to dissipate some heat that way as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the way in which we can dissipate heat. There are 4 different mechanisms. Again, we mentioned sweat. We also mentioned blood flow to the skin surface, but let's take a look at what's happening in order for us to dissipate heat. Okay, so there are 4 different ways in which we can dissipate heat. Number 1 is conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. Okay, so again, we think about heat dissipation. This is super important to us. So imagine right now in my office, it's like, I don't know, 68 or 70 degrees in here. Okay, and my body temperature is like 90 something, right? And this is a comfortable environment. And the reason that this is comfortable is because I'm constantly producing heat. And so we would like to be suspended in an environment that's actually cooler than what our body temperature is. Okay, and what that tells us is that we're constantly producing heat, and the reason for that has to do with our metabolic rate. Okay, so as we metabolize calories, we're also going to lose heat, and a significant amount of those calories will be dissipated as heat or lost in the energy form of heat. Okay, so about 60% of the food that we broke down will be lost as the energy is released as heat from the body. Okay, about 40% efficiency. Think about that as it relates to a machine. We're not very efficient, right? So only about 40% of the energy that we intake, we actually utilize for useful work. The other 60% of that energy that we've intaken will be lost in the form of heat. Okay. So again, you think about when you exercise, if I'm comfortable right now in 70 degrees and I'm able to maintain my body temperature, super easily in that particular environment, as I start to exercise and as I start to increase my metabolic rate, I also begin to increase the amount of heat that I'm producing, right? Which is why we sweat, which is why we get hot when we exercise. So again, we've got to think about those factors when we think about temperature regulation. So let's take a look at the 4 ways in which we can dissipate heat. Again, our body is very good at heat dissipation. We're less good at heat conservation. So we're built to more effectively get rid of heat than we are to kind of conserve our heat. Okay, so conduction and convection. So let's start with conduction. So conduction is the exchange of heat through direct contact. So again, if I go to a football game and I sit on the bench and the bench is cold and my butt is my my normal body temperature, we're going to reach an equilibrium. So as those surfaces touch each other, the seat or that bleacher is going to get warmer and my butt's going to get colder. Okay, so that's the direct contact of 2 different surfaces, and the temperature will come to an equilibrium between those 2 particular surfaces. Okay, convection has to do with heat exchange via movement around us. So again, we usually think about convection as it relates to wind movement or water movement. Okay, so you think about like a convection oven, for example. The way a convection oven works is it basically like has a little fan or like a blower inside the oven, and it's going to kind of like swirl the heat around, and the swirling of the heat allows us to cook the molecules or cook that food like more evenly, and I guess it's supposed to like taste better. I don't know, I'm not a great baker, but that's basically how a convection oven works. So again, we think about convection as it relates to heat. If you think about, being outside when it's 40 degrees and sunny and no wind, that feels pretty comfortable. However, if I'm outside and it's 40 degrees and it's cloudy and, it's super windy, we're going to lose heat very quickly, because as that wind crosses our skin surface, that's going to collect some of the heat off the skin surface. So that's kind of what convection does. Number 3 is radiation, and radiation can serve as either a heat gain or a heat dissipator for us. And so radiation has to do with so we have like these electromagnetic rays that are coming off of us in every single direction, and each of those electromagnetic rays are going to like bounce onto whatever surface is directly around us. So again, even though I'm not directly touching the wall, the electromagnetic rays that I'm releasing will bounce off the wall, and therefore the wall will become warmer because I'm in the room. So that's one way that we dissipate heat through radiation. We also gain heat from the sun through radiation. So again, the sun has those same electromagnetic rays. And so, you know, if it's 40 degrees and cloudy, that feels significantly colder than if it's 40 degrees and sunny, because if it's sunny, I'm gaining some heat through the radiation mechanism. Okay. And then lastly, and most important to us when we think about body temperature regulation, is the concept of evaporation. So again, in order for us to effectively dissipate heat, it's not only important for us to put sweat on the skin surface, we also have to allow those sweat molecules to be accepted into the air. So those water molecules have to be transferred from a liquid form into a gaseous form. Okay, and that's the only way that we can effectively dissipate heat. So every time I sweat and that sweat drips off of me, that was ineffective sweating. So when sweat drips off of me and it's not modified from the liquid form into the gaseous form, then I've just wasted the sweat, basically. Okay, so the only way for us to actually get anything out of sweating is when that sweat molecule is converted from liquid to gas. Okay. So again, we said that water will help us to remove different waste products. So most unstable substances in the body will dissolve in water and exit through urine. You know, we said urine, but also sweat will serve as a way for us to kind of get rid of some of those waste products. So urea is a component that is, you know, an important byproduct of protein metabolism. So as we produce urea, we need to get rid of it generally through the urine. We can also get rid of it through the sweat as well. Sodium is another component that we will remove as a waste product. Again, that can come through urine or through sweat. Okay, we typically produce about 1 liter of urine per day. Again, a lot of variation there depending on my hydration status and, you know, the types of foods I'm consuming. Again, if I consume more proteins and so I'm breaking down more proteins, I'm producing more urea, that can cause an increase in urine, and many other factors as well. Certainly caffeine or alcohol can increase the amount of urine that I'm producing. So heavy ion concentration in the urine increases our risk of kidney stones. And kidney stones are basically formed from minerals and other substances that accumulate in the kidney tissues. So basically our kidney's job is to kind of filter through everything in the blood and figure out like what's the waste product and then get rid of that through the urine. And again, if I have a lot of those components within the blood, I'm maybe not very hydrated. And so, you know, it's super concentrated with kind of some of those waste products that could potentially cause kidney stones. We also believe that there's certainly a genetic component to why people get kidney stones. Some people are just more predisposed to get those than others. So, you know, that could certainly be related as well to, you know, why somebody might get those. But again, end of the day, we need to make sure we have enough fluid so that we can remove those waste products effectively via urine and also via sweat. So how much water do I need? So you need about 1 milliliter of water per kcal expended. So again, if I expended an average of 2,000 calories per day, I need about 2,000 milliliters or 2 liters of water per day. Okay. Generally, we get about 80% of our water from different fluids. Again, it doesn't have to be just water. You can certainly get fluids from other substances, you know, juice, milk, coffee, alcohol, etc., pop. Okay. But again, ideally, we want a large portion of those fluids to come from just strictly water. Foods can also give us some water as well. So foods supply about 15% of our water content. So about 5% of the water that we have within the body is formed via metabolism. So water is actually a waste product of the aerobic metabolic pathways. So we're producing water while we're doing aerobic metabolism. So that's good news. And then as we mentioned, when we start to use carbohydrates as a fuel, we also liberate a little bit of water as well. Okay, so again, we are getting kind of some of those components from other locations as well. Okay. Let's see, water intake, about 1.7 liters per day is what is recommended. Other beverages, 48 fluid ounces, maybe 1.4 liters per day. Again, could be coffee, could be teas, could be, soda, could be milk, juice, etc. Okay. Certainly can vary depending on our body weight. So again, and body composition as well. So again, if I have a high amount of muscle mass and a low amount of fat mass, I'm going to need more water in comparison to somebody who has a higher amount of fat mass and a lower amount of muscle. Okay. Can also vary depending on life cycle or your age as well. So developmentally, that can make a difference. Under normal circumstances, again, here's just kind of some estimates. Females need about 8.5 cups per day. Males need almost 12 cups per day. Again, those are just averages. You'd be better off to kind of look at the body weight of the individual, and then also, what's their energy expenditure in one day in order for us to really get an accurate amount. We mentioned that some of the foods that we consume contain water in them, and it turns out lots of fruits and vegetables have lots of water. So I just thought this was interesting. This just kind of gives you an idea of the percentage of each food molecule that contains water. Again, these are kind of some of our common healthy foods that we've talked about previously, but you can see cucumbers, dark leafy greens, blueberries are great, strawberries, all sorts of different fruits and vegetables are really high in water content. So maybe you're not big on drinking water, but you really like a fruit. Well, you're getting a fair amount of water through the fruit that you are consuming each day. Okay, again, here's another image that kind of just shows us some of those good choices for us as it relates to fruits and vegetables that contain a high amount of fluids. Okay, so let's take a look at water loss. So again, we already mentioned that you're going to produce about 1 liter of urine per day. We're also going to lose some water in some other ways as well. So about 500 mils or a half a liter of fluid will be lost through respiration. So again, every time you breathe out, we're getting rid of some water molecules that way. And so that can account for actually a fairly significant amount of fluid loss in any given day. We also lose about 150 mils through feces, and then another half a liter through something known as insensible perspiration. And insensible perspiration is the sweat that you don't know that you are producing. So we're actually constantly sweating. Okay, and insensible perspiration is sweat that's evaporated immediately off your skin surface. So again, when we think about this insensible perspiration, I think that it's really cool to think about different environmental conditions that we've been in and how this affects that perspiration. So if you've ever gone any place like that's dry, like the desert, maybe you went to like Arizona or even someplace dry like Colorado, for example, it's really common that our skin will become a little bit dry. Again, if you're from the Midwest, I'm assuming that you are a Midwesterner and not used to those kind of dry conditions. So again, if we were to travel to Colorado or Arizona or something like that, where it's very dry there, it's very easy for our lips to become chapped and very easy for our skin to be dry and flaky. And the reason for that is because the ambient air is more dry. There's less water molecules in the ambient air. So it's easier for those water molecules that are on your skin surface to be picked up and accepted into the air. So basically the fluid on your skin surface is easily pulled out when you're in those dry environments. And again, if you're used to living someplace like the Midwest where we've got a fair amount of humidity, it's easy for those factors to have a significant impact on us. And like I said, cause our lips to become really chapped or those types of things, right? Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on that one. So again, we've kind of talked about how much fluid we need and how much fluid we're losing. Again, ideally, those two factors should match every single day. And you know, how do you know how much you need? Certainly the environment is going to play a huge role in determining how much fluid I actually need on a day-to-day basis. And it turns out that thirst is not a reliable signal for water needs, particularly during vigorous exercise. And then when we look at these different age discrepancies, so infants and older individuals are not great at heat dissipation. Again, their mechanism for sweating is not as attuned to changes within the body, so they're not as good at dissipating heat through sweat. So thirst is not a great way for us to indicate when we should be drinking more. So we have to be in front of that. If we wait until we get thirsty, we're too late when we're looking at performance as it relates to hydration. So thirst for athletes, because thirst is not a reliable mechanism, we should monitor our fluid status. We could weigh athletes before and after sessions, and athletes should ideally consume 24 fluid ounces for every pound that they've lost. Again, are we really actually doing this in real life? Probably not. Maybe sometimes, in preseason, that sort of thing. I've seen this happen with our football teams when it's super hot outside and we've got like a camp or something along those lines. Certainly our wrestlers will be weighing themselves pretty frequently, but otherwise we're not really doing this. We're not doing a great job of monitoring fluid status in our athletes. We could do a lot better. What happens if we ignore our thirst? The body will register that there's a shortage of water, and therefore it'll try to increase our fluid conservation. Okay, so as we decrease fluid within the body, this will cause a decrease in blood pressure. And the reason for that is, again, we thought about those three different components within the body as it relates to fluid location. So we have the intracellular, the extracellular, the plasma volume. And so we can shift water pretty easily amongst those three categories. Okay, so if I start to dissipate a lot of heat, maybe I'm sweating quite a bit, and so I'm getting rid of a lot of that fluid. This will cause the amount of fluid in my plasma or the amount of fluid in my blood to decrease. Okay, as I decrease the amount of fluid that's in the blood, this causes my blood pressure to drop. So again, think about like a tube where there's water flowing through. If I decrease the amount of fluid that's in the tube, that'll also cause a decrease in the pressure exerted against that tube. Okay, so as I decrease fluid in the body, this will cause a decrease in blood pressure. And this will stimulate the release of two different hormones. Number one is called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And again, if you think about what a diuretic is, an example of a diuretic would be, coffee, alcohol, those types of things. Again, a diuretic is something that's going to make us go pee more often. Okay, so an antidiuretic is going to prevent us from going pee. Okay, so ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, is going to be released, and this will help us to conserve water. So it's going to help us to hold on to more water and eliminate less water in our pee or in our urine. Okay, we're also going to release a hormone that's going to work very closely with ADH, and that's known as aldosterone. And aldosterone's job is to help us to conserve sodium. Okay, so within the kidneys, it's going to help us to reabsorb or pull back the sodium so that it stays within the body. And based on what we know about electrolytes, if I pull sodium back in, I'm also going to pull water with it. Okay, so by retaining sodium, that's also going to help me to retain water as well, which is what we want. So we think about some of these issues associated with a decrease in water concentration within the body, also known as dehydration. Here are some of the negative consequences that we see. 1 to 2% fluid loss within the body. That's when we'll kind of stimulate the feeling of thirst. And again, if we get to that point, we're too late in the process. If we have a 4% loss in fluid, muscles will lose significant strength and endurance. 10 to 12% loss, our heat tolerance is decrease substantially, and we'll also start experiencing more weakness as it relates to both muscular strength and endurance. And if we reach water loss or dehydration levels of 20% or more, we can experience heat-related illness and also death. So again, we think about what reasons are we experiencing, this drastic amount of water loss. Again, generally speaking, there's two reasons. Number one is environmental conditions, and number two is the intensity at which we're working, right? So again, high intensity will produce more heat, which will cause us to lose fluids. And then additionally, when we're in an environmental condition that can be a strain for us, that will also cause us to experience a significant loss in fluids. We also need to understand the initial hydration status of an individual. So if we're dehydrated in the first place, that is certainly problematic. So can certain beverages, foods, or medications contribute to fluid losses? Yeah, absolutely. So, caffeinated products such as coffee is a diuretic, so that will cause us to become dehydrated pretty easily. Speaking of, I better drink some of my coffee. Alcohol, soy sauce. Alcohol is a diuretic as well. Soy sauce, any type of processed salty meats, popcorn, fried food, fizzy sugary beverages such as, pop or soda, and then asparagus actually as well. So all of those foods and beverages could contribute to substantial fluid loss. The reason asparagus, again, can cause this is it has to do with the amino acid content within asparagus, and as we break down those amino acids, it produces more urea than like an average product, I guess. And so as a result, that's going to cause us to need to use that renal system or release or get rid of the urea through our urine. So now let's take a look at some hydration tips for our athletes. So again, we think about practical guidelines for our athletes. The goal of daily fluid consumption is to A, ensure optimal health, and B, ensure optimal performance. Okay, so again, our first goal is always to keep our athletes healthy, and then our second goal is to help them improve their performance or prevent a decline in performance. Okay, so each individual athlete should be aware of what they need. Again, there can be so much variation from person to person, and then also as we think about changes in environment, particularly for outdoor athletes. So optimal hydration should stimulate urination every 1 to 2 hours. That seems absolutely crazy to me. I don't think that that's a super realistic goal. However, that is what the guidelines say. Okay. So we think about pre-exercise hydration. So what should we be, doing prior to exercise in order to maintain kind of this optimal level? So individuals who avoid fluids before training can fatigue more easily. They might experience dizziness or faintness. And again, that could be related to if I'm consuming, fluids that contain carbohydrates as well. So that dizziness or faintness could be related to hypoglycemia or low sugar levels as well. They'll also experience a faster rise in core temperature. Again, that's a pretty decent threat for us when we're in a hot environment. Increased heart rate. So again, the increased heart rate is going to occur concurrently with this change in core temperature. Okay, so the higher my core temperature is, the greater my heart rate response will also be, even if that absolute workload is not that high. So it will also increase our perception of the level of exertion. So again, doing that same task is going to feel much more challenging if I'm in a dehydrated state. And then, lastly, and debatably most importantly, we'll experience suboptimal performance for these individuals if they're not hydrated appropriately prior to exercise. Okay. Ideally, optimal fluid consumption starts 24 hours before an exercise bout. So again, most of our athletes are working out every day, or 5 or 6 days a week is pretty standard for both, college and high school level athletes. So it's important that they're staying hydrated basically all the time. So fluid intake, like we said, this is a constant thing that we need to really be thinking about every day. Okay. Fluid intake 1 to 2 hours prior to exercise can enhance our ability to regulate body temperature and also help us to keep that heart rate lower when we start doing submaximal and maximal exercise. So again, that can be a benefit for us when we think about exercise performance. So how much do we need to intake? Again, I would caution you that these guidelines are standard. However, so much individual variation depending on the size of the person, you know, what sport they're in, what the intensity is of the workout, and then most importantly, the environmental conditions. So ACSM recommends 4 hours before exercise starts, they should drink 400 to 600 mils of fluid. Again, that's a nice standard number. I think that guideline is pretty good, regardless of who the individual is. So we're looking at 13 to 20 ounces of fluid 4 hours before. So, you know, if we're going to work out in the afternoon, maybe this is around lunchtime or whatever, 13 to 20 ounces is easy to get in with your lunch. Okay. 2 hours prior to, we're going to take in a little bit less. I think this ends up being, again, depending on the person, maybe 10 to 15 ounces 2 hours before exercise. Okay. And then 10 to 20 minutes prior to exercise, they should take in another 200 to 300 mils, which is equivalent to between 7 to 10 ounces. So again, you know, half a water bottle full is appropriate at that particular time point. Again, I think all of these are fairly standard as it relates to the practicality. So I think it's super practical that individuals can get these guidelines met leading up to a practice. Again, I would encourage our athletes to think about, you know, when is this most important? Anytime I'm going to do something long or really high intensity or hot environments. What should they be consuming? Okay, so water is great, especially if they're consuming a snack with it, maybe a granola bar, banana, etc. Juices is another option, so this can offer us the benefit of carbohydrates and maybe some electrolytes. Could cause some GI distress because fruit juice is going to be high in fructose. So again, remember when we think about the absorption of fructose molecules, it's going to move through facilitated diffusion, which means it's slow. So that slow process can cause maybe some issues with gastric emptying or cause GI distress if I consume that too close to the start of that workout. Milk would be another option. Again, I would never choose this pre-exercise, but maybe post-exercise might be a better option because it contains both the protein and carbohydrates. You know, you've probably heard that chocolate milk is a great recovery tool. And the reason for that is it's got an optimal level of proteins and carbohydrates to kind of hit that metabolic window post-exercise. Again, using milk before could be difficult for us to digest because it contains lactose. That can become problematic for some individuals. Upset stomach, bloating, diarrhea can also be issues consuming milk too close to the start of a workout. Okay. Coffee and tea, again, as we mentioned, coffee is a diuretic. So that can be problematic because it can, cause us to become dehydrated instead of actually hydrating us. But we do know that there's a link, and we'll talk about this when we get to our ergogenic aids. We do know there's a link between caffeine and endurance performance. There's also a debatable link between caffeine and muscular power, muscular endurance types of exercise as well. So caffeine can certainly be an advantage in those particular situations. We also want to consider an individual's tolerance and familiarity with that particular caffeinated beverage. So again, I would never want someone to try coffee on the day of their, championship game or performance or anything like that, because we're not sure what their tolerance is or how familiar they are with it. And again, we don't want to try anything new on the day of an important performance. Sports drinks can be formulated for fluid replacement during exercise. These can be used appropriately immediately following the exercise bout as well. So again, they've got those carbohydrates in them, also the electrolytes such as sodium and potassium to kind of help us to either, preload if we're taking it before exercise, certainly used during the exercise bout for fluid replacement, and then also post-exercise to kind of assist with glycogen replenishment after a strenuous exercise bout. Pop or soda is not appropriate. It's high in refined sugars. Also, the carbonation can become an issue for individuals when we think about gastric distress and those types of things as well. However, I will tell you that there are, like in Ironman triathlons, they serve Coca-Cola on the course, on the run course, and I actually prefer it. And what they do is they'll set it out so that it becomes flat, so the fizziness is basically gone by the time you get to it. But it's a nice blend, in my opinion, of sugar and caffeine. So again, that is a product that is used in triathlons, for example. Again, I don't think we would recommend this for your average college or high school athlete, however. Okay, so when we think about hydration during the exercise bout, what are our goals? Our goals are to, number one, maintain plasma volume, and number two, keep electrolytes in balance. So when we think about, maintaining our electrolyte balance, what that tells us is the beverage that we're consuming should also include electrolytes if that is a goal for us. Okay, dehydration and water intoxication can negatively impact our performance. And when we think about water intoxication, if I'm consuming like a bunch of water with no electrolytes in it, that can cause something called hyponatremia, and we'll talk about that later in this lecture. But again, basically, if I'm just consuming the fluids and I don't have those electrolytes, this can negatively impact my performance because I've kind of lost that balance of electrolytes within the different compartments of the body. So again, hyponatremia, as we just mentioned, is basically caused by this electrolyte disturbance. So sodium concentration is lower than what it should be. So again, we're kind of off as it relates to our equilibrium of sodium in these various compartments within the body. So lack of sodium is rarely cause for hyponatremia. So again, it's not that these people are not having enough sodium. Again, it has to do with this kind of balance. So here's a study that in 2002 Boston Marathon, 13% of our athletes were in a hyponatremic state. And again, I think what's interesting about this is, you think about an event like the Boston Marathon, for example. So there's like 30,000 people that do this race. Okay, so a shit ton of people. And then also like this race is like lined with spectators the whole way, which also means that there's like a ton of aid stations. So basically you're running along this 26 miles and there are aid stations pretty much every single mile. So you have access to a lot of things. Okay, so again, individuals are more likely to stop and get water or whatever when it's readily available. So again, that's probably one of the reasons why we see such a high rate of hyponatremia in something like the Boston Marathon, because the access of water is just right there. So it's very easy for individuals to kind of overconsume in those particular scenarios. So what are the risk factors for developing hyponatremia? Again, I will tell you in my experience as an athlete slash coach slash professor in this field, I have never seen anybody experience hyponatremia personally. I have seen lots of individuals experience dehydration and dehydration related issues. Okay, so again, I would say that this is a pretty rare situation. So what are our risk factors? Who is at risk for developing this? So if you're doing exercise duration of greater than 4 hours, you're running at a slower pace. Again, it wouldn't necessarily have to be running. It could certainly be other types of aerobic events where you're doing something for 4 hours or more. More common in females than in males. And again, we'll talk about some gender differences when we think about sweat rates and things like that. But, basically males sweat more than females. So males probably need more fluids, whereas our females are maybe not sweating as much. And so therefore, when they consume their fluids, it's kind of easier to overconsume. Low body weight, so again, we're looking at small women who experience this. Excessive drinking, so again, as we mentioned with like the Boston Marathon, for example, it's very accessible. So you can help yourself at every single aid station, and you're looking at, 26 different times that you've stopped to drink fluids in a 4-hour, 5-hour span. Okay. Pre-exercise overhydration. So again, I'm really concerned with my hydration. I've got this big event, and so I'm just like chugging a bunch of fluids. So I'm overhydrated to start with. As we mentioned, abundant availability of those fluids at the event, and then using, drugs like ibuprofen or something like that. Maybe my knee was bothering me, and so I took some ibuprofen before the start of the race or whatever. And then also extreme conditions such as extreme hot or extreme cold, which might cause individuals to stop and drink more than what they would if it was just a normal average, thermoneutral type of day. So what are the consequences of hyponatremia? Confusion, seizures, altered mental status, impaired renal function, so issues with the kidneys, respiratory distress, headaches, vomiting, edema, which is swelling, and then death. And unfortunately, one of the issues with hyponatremia is a lot of these symptoms are the same symptoms that we see when people are dehydrated. So again, it's very difficult for us to know which side of the fence we're on here with the hydration. So again, this would be a really important component for our athletic trainers to be aware of. And again, if you're coaching anyone that might fit into this, type of category, it's really important to kind of understand the signs and symptoms of either dehydration or hyponatremia, so that you can understand when your athlete might be in one, status versus the other. Okay. So again, I would emphasize that hyponatremia is not super common. Much more common are issues with dehydration. And issues with dehydration can cause substantially decreased exercise performance. Okay, so exercise performance is decreased substantially if I become dehydrated. Okay. If I lose as little as 2% of my body weight, this will cause a substantial decrease in performance. Losses of excess of 5% of body weight can decrease work capacity by 30% in endurance sports, right? That is a shit ton of decrease in performance, 30%. That's a lot. And this isn't just for endurance athletes. We also see this with our anaerobic or high power athletes as well. So for sprint athletes, time to exhaustion can decrease by 45% with a very small loss in body weight, 2.5%. Okay, so again, regardless of who you're coaching, this is super important for us as it relates to exercise performance. Okay. So even in thermoneutral environments, if VO2 max will decrease by 5% if we lose 3% of our body mass or more. Okay, so again, for your 150-pound person, losing a little over 4 pounds can cause a substantial decrease in their aerobic capacity. That's super easy to do. I can tell you that. I know that there are wrestlers or wrestling coaches in the audience right now, and again, super easy to lose 4 to 5 pounds in one single workout. So again, we think about these decreases, and man, they have a substantial impact on performance. If we could get our athletes to stay hydrated all the time, man, their potential to perform at their optimal level is much, much better. Okay. Endurance performance will have more of a severe impairment when it's related to dehydration. And again, the reason for that is we think about changes in blood. So when you get dehydrated, your blood's going to become thicker or more viscous in nature, which makes it more difficult or more stress on the heart. So think about the heart trying to pump a milkshake versus water, right? It's more stress for the heart. It's also harder for that blood to move fast when it's like a milkshake versus like water. Okay. So again, we think about the importance of the cardiovascular system as it relates to endurance performance. This is very problematic. Okay. We're going to slow down our ability to deliver oxygen, to pick up waste, remove those wastes, deliver nutrients. So again, this whole transportation system is going to be slowed down. And so that can significantly impair our exercise performance in those particular scenarios. Again, exercise in the heat will be, impaired to a much greater extent in comparison to exercise in a thermoneutral environment. And the reason for that is something known as cardiovascular drift. And cardiovascular drift has to do with where we want to send blood to. And we're going to kind of fight for different locations to get that blood flow. Okay, so again, in a hot environment, I want to send blood to my skin surface so I can dissipate heat. And I also want to send blood to the muscles so that I can deliver oxygen and nutrients so that they can do their job, right? So again, we're kind of fighting or competing for blood flow via this cardiovascular drift. And so therefore, exercise in a hot environment can be much more of a challenge for us in comparison to doing exercise in that thermoneutral environment where I don't need to send blood to my skin surface. So again, we said one of the major issues associated with, not hydrating appropriately would be dehydration. So again, dehydration is going to be the consequence of a negative water balance. So if I'm, getting rid of more water than I'm taking in, then, that will put me in a dehydrated state. Some of the consequences include overheating, increased cardiovascular stress. Again, we talked about how, fluid can leave the blood, and so the blood becomes more viscous or thicker in nature, and again, that causes more strain on the heart. Again, imagine trying to pump a milkshake versus pumping water. So again, can cause an increase in cardiovascular stress, can cause muscle cramping as well. So again, some of that fluid that's kind of suspending the muscle is eliminated, and that can cause some muscle cramping issues. Decreased metabolic efficiency. So again, if I'm doing something at a low or moderate intensity or long duration, generally I want to rely on fats as a fuel. And as I become dehydrated, I'm more likely to choose carbs as a fuel. So again, that can cause some metabolic inefficiencies if I am planning to do something for a long duration. Reduced blood volume. We kind of already mentioned that, associated with this change in, blood or the amount of fluid within the blood. Decreased skin blood flow. So again, as we start to create a more viscous type of blood, this is going to make it more challenging for us to send some of the blood to the skin surface and also still deliver that blood to the muscles so that it can be used. We'll also see a decrease in sweat rate as well. Again, if I decrease my sweat rate, this is certainly going to impact my ability to, control my temperature. Okay, so thermoregulation can be impacted substantially. We'll see a decrease in heat dissipation, which again is going to put me at a great risk for heat stroke or heat-related illnesses. Increasing core temperature as it relates to some of these factors, such as the decreased sweat rate and also our decreased ability to send blood to the skin surface. And then lastly, an increase in the rate of muscle glycogen. So again, instead of being efficient with my fuels, I am going to utilize carbohydrates as opposed to fats. So again, when we think about hydration recommendations during exercise, it doesn't actually do us any good to pour water on our heads. Again, it might feel good in the moment, and from a psychological standpoint, it might, make the athlete feel a little bit of relief if we're exercising in the heat. But it turns out this doesn't actually do us any good from a thermoregulatory standpoint or a hydration standpoint. Okay. So when we think about hydration during exercise, water and electrolyte losses during exercise are going to vary substantially depending on many factors. So certainly the most important will be the environmental factors. So again, a hot, humid environment is the greatest threat to us, followed closely by a humid but not hot environment, followed closely by then a hot, dry heat. The good news about a dry heat is our evaporative system is pretty efficient in that standpoint. So again, we might feel comfortable in 90 degrees if it's a dry heat versus a humid heat. The mode of exercise will also play a role. Again, if I'm biking, for example, you've got more heat loss through convection because you're having more air rush across your skin's surface. So again, it kind of creates that wind, so to speak, even if it's not a windy day, versus something like running where I'm going to be moving at a slower pace, so less convection is occurring, also burning more calories or increasing metabolic rate to a greater extent during running in a general sense. Okay, training status. So actually individuals that are highly trained are going to sweat sooner in comparison to people that are not highly trained. And again, that's kind of a surprise to a lot of people, but really think about this from a homeostasis perspective. So again, if I'm highly trained and I go out and start running or biking or whatever it is that I'm going to do, my body immediately knows like, hey, okay, we're going to do something where we're going to stress the system. So if I start sweating now, I can kind of stay ahead of it. Okay, so again, we think about the difference there. Certainly somebody who is more trained is going to be better able to manage environmental conditions and, those various issues that we've talked about. Body composition or body size, again, the larger you are, probably the greater the amount of hydration that we need. And then also gender, males tend to be more wasteful sweaters. So as a result, they're going to need to likely hydrate more than a female counterpart. Okay, what should we do within a race event? Something along those lines. So for slow paces or low intensity exercise, fluid loss is about 500 mils per hour, so 16 to 20 ounces. So ideally, we want to replace that. So again, if I'm going to do exercise for greater than 60 minutes, I need to be consuming 16 to 20 ounces per hour while I'm doing that. If it's a hot and humid environment, fluid loss is a lot. So 2 to 3 liters per hour. It would be nearly impossible in order for us to match that. Okay, so again, pre-hydration is really important if we're in a hot, humid environment, and then also knowing that we need to back off that intensity a little bit because we are going to, lose so much fluid. For short duration exercise, water is great source for us as it relates to hydration. For long duration exercise or hot and humid environments where we're really losing a lot, electrolyte replacement should be used as well. Okay, so again, something like a Gatorade or some sort of sports beverage that contains electrolytes but also carbohydrates would be great. Okay. So again, we think about some of these issues, and again, a lot of times we think about hydration as it relates to the heat or humidity, and it turns out that we can actually become better at coping with these particular types of situations. So heat acclimatization can occur within 10 to 14 days. So again, in order for us to do that, we need to not only be in those particular environments, but we also have to exercise at the appropriate intensity that we wish to compete in those environments in order for us to adapt to those particular temperatures. Okay, so again, in a hot and humid environment, athletes are generally not able to replace all their fluids while exercising. So what they're doing after the fact is very, very important, and also before the exercise bout as well. So as it relates to post-exercise hydration, again, we should shoot for 16 to 24 ounces of either fluid or some sort of beverage for every pound that's lost during the exercise. Again, we want to try to get those fluids in as quickly as we can. This can also include, as mentioned, electrolytes, carbohydrates, could include protein as well, if we really want to maximize the recovery process post-exercise. So what are the best fluids? Water is our number one choice. Again, athletes tend to want to choose water, especially if it's a hot or humid environment, but drinks that contain carbohydrates and sodium, such as, Gatorade or some other of the sports drink products, are also ideal because of the electrolytes and the carbohydrate benefit that we get from those. I think that is it for today. Hope you guys have a great day.